And good morning. Welcome to the old school on a nice, beautiful, sunny day in North Texas in mid December. The season nigh upon us, the season by which we will not speak of. We've done it too many times, but rather we're going to talk about, well, frankly, anything we're interested in talking about. It sometimes, most of the time, deals with education, but it could deal with a whole host of things. And with me in this endeavor is Herr Dr. Bourgeois. Good morning, Dr. Bourgeois.
Hey Miller, it's good to see you. I missed the countdown. Normally you do a silent countdown before you start the episode and you just kind of jump right in. So I'm a step behind now. I'll be behind for the whole podcast.
That's when we did the other audio program because we had to have the countdown to know when things were starting. Now things are starting because we're back on Zoom. Things are starting as soon as you press record. So
So it's a visual cue.
yeah. So well, whatever, however you want to characterize it,
Okay, okay.
whatever helps you understand it and feel more comfortable with it.
I'm comfortable to begin with. You mentioned this season and the holidays, and I've already gone on record, finding it trouble.
Repeatedly.
Yeah, for months on end. I mean, it's actually about I would say a quarter of the year would be the holiday season. Starting in October, going through the football games in January.
But I can't help but think that your attitude about holidays is somewhat manufactured, somewhat put upon. It's not possible that your heart, three sizes too small, to quote the great Dr. Seuss, it's not possible that you are such a curmudgeon that you do not see some of the more wonderful elements of the holiday season. Certainly, you like joy, maybe on some level, and maybe you have to look for it deeper. I don't know.
I don't seek out happiness. I seek out my work, Miller. I think that's why I have failed where others have succeeded. Say it here and now.
What was it? George Will said he grew up in Illinois, and his friends decided to be Cardinal fans, and they grew up liberal and happy. And he chose to become a Cubs fan, and he grew up conservative and angry. You went a direction different from all your other friends.
That would be true about the Cubs fans. You've already talked about them saying they're, what do you call them, insufferable? Is that
Well,
the
long suffering.
long suffering? That's for sure. But they finally got their comet or their World Series. That was, in fact, we were there. Not when they won, but a few days after, if I recall.
Yeah. The thing about the Cubs fans, and I think I've mentioned it before, is that the Cubs fans have historically mixed two things that typically do not go together: ineptitude and arrogance. Typically you're either inept at something and feel bad and ashamed for your ineptitude, or you're incredible at it, and therefore there's a certain level of arrogance that comes into that. Cubs fans have historically chosen both paths, which does not seem possible, but I remember the first Cubs game I saw the Cubs play the Astros down in Houston, and they were just annoying. And that was before their World Series. They had not won a World Series in over a century, and yet they were arrogant about the fact that they were Cubs fans. And so part of it, I want to perhaps separate it between the nouveau popular Cubs fans, the ones who have the brand new Cubs hat that clearly has not seen much wear or tear, and the traditional hardcore generational Cubs fans who accepted their misery, perhaps with a little bit of a badge of honor, but nevertheless they accepted the misery. And so perhaps we're talking about two different groups of people. I don't know, but
Well, the part you're losing me, you're calling them inept and arrogant, and I don't know how fans can be inept. I mean, their team can be inept, but what about how can you have an inept fan base?
here's the reason. because you have a group of fans who talk as if they're on the team. And you hear this all the time. We killed the Cowboys last week. We what position do you play exactly? And because you have this kind of fan orientation as if they're actually part of the process, unfortunately, you then get the orientation of somebody who feels that they have a reason to be arrogant or they have a reason to be inept, or what have you. They take on the characteristics of the team. And so um, it's a strange dynamic, I'll grant you, but I'm going to stick with it.
Thank you, Herr Miller. I'm not sure where this conversation started or how we ended up, bashing the people of Chicago are very, very nice people.
I'm not bashing. I'm merely I'm merely speaking truth to power, Steve. That's what I do here. And so, but what we're going to talk about today is something that we have not talked about in its pure form. We've talked about it in terms of how it appears in education, how it is to teach it, and something like that. But I wanted to talk about it more from a context of us as fans, and that has to do with music. Now, one of the things that I always was kind of distressed about is when I would talk to students who were in the band and they would play jazz or they would play other kinds of music, but they didn't listen to it. You and I are both fans. So, but you are the musician of the two of us. So you are the more adroit with the knowledge of jazz and the kind of particulars of jazz. Your skill set allows you to be much more informed of the style. From the time you started playing music, how does what you play shape what you listen to?
Wow. I mean, I always listened to classical music and jazz, but then I also would listen to, popular music, particularly classic rock and other things. I think it's almost like part of it is, I mean, I would call it, serious art music on a different plane. I mean, I'm talking particularly about classical music. And so it's really difficult for me to speak about that in the same breath of anything. I mean, jazz has, you could call it the American classical music in a way. But still, it's to me there's a difference between classical music and jazz, and then popular music is on a different plane, and that's me being arrogant, which is really what I am. Come to think of it.
Well, let's talk about it in terms of the things that you perhaps play. When you talk about classical music or jazz, what is the difference between being a fan or an admirer of classical music in contrast to, being a fan or of jazz music? How do you what is the difference in the musicianship, but also the fandom of those two forms of music?
Well, with any type of music, but particularly classical music, you need to listen to a piece multiple times to unwrap it. And you're typically not going to be blown away the first time you hear it, and it's going to sound different every time. And the process, as a musician, as a classical musician particularly, is that you're learning expectation, and that's a listening skill. So you're in the moment, but you're also predicting what's going to happen next. And the more data you have, meaning listening, the more accurate you are with those predictions. And the more you enjoy the piece. So you're in this flow state. And the composer, you're listening to a piece by Mozart, and it feels like there's a sequence, which is a repeated pattern. And then suddenly there's an ornament, or there's a false cadence, or a different move. And it's not only surprising, but suddenly it becomes satisfying and it feels right. And so that's the genius of the composer, is they take you along, they surprise you, they build up with anticipation of some sort of resolution, And the more insightful you are, the more you can actually ride along and enjoy that. And so you go a whole lifetime listening to these pieces, and they actually grow with depth every time you hear them.
Do you think it is? I'm wondering about the difference between being a fan of, say, classical music without having the ability to play. So, to not being able to understand music at that level, does that change how you appreciate classical music, or do you think classical music, perhaps like other kinds of music, that there are ways in which you can enjoy it at the same level as someone who plays?
I think everybody has a different set of ears and a different set of expectations. So I can't really say what, the other people, what their experience is, but knowing some of the technical aspects, I mean, you know what's possible on the instruments.
Hmm.
Um, and you know something about harmony. I mean, I studied, in high school, I took voice leading and composition, and so knowing, what's behind all that. And I think what you gain as a performer is, um, you understand that there's the immediate experience, but there's also a bigger structure under that piece. And you see I think you have a broader, longer context. So you're not just in the now, but you also see where it started, and you realize it's telling a story. It's a tragedy that's happening, typically, and that's the best music has an air of the tragic in it, and so you're able to appreciate that. But also playing, when you're practicing, you're learning that, and you're learning the subtlety, the details of the phrase. You've watched pianists, how they move their wrists up and down a little bit, and that's not an affectation. That's not a performing technique for the audience sake. But when your hand is lifted, your finger is farther from the key, meaning you can't play as loudly. And so it's a way to regulate the sound very subtly. And so with your as a non-musician, you don't know that, and you're watching them raise their arms like they're doing something that's important, but it really has to do with execution. And that's just the beginning. I guess that's my first take on it. But there's a lot of subtlety and complexity that you only develop if you performed to a certain level on an instrument.
I'm very fascinated by these concepts, and at the risk of sounding like I'm blowing smoke, we've had some great guests on who have talked about their various expertise,
Mhm.
but I don't think we've really dug into your expertise, and I think clearly one of them has to do with music, and I feel like it's been a hole in our repertoire that we really have not talked about this. When you compare classical music with jazz music, what is the difference for you as a musician and how you appreciate jazz music compared to classical? Or is it the same?
It's different because I mean, at a certain level, when you're performing any piece, there's a level of improvisation. It may not be the notes, but it's the way that you play with the tempo, or dynamics, or whatever. So a performer, no matter what, particularly a soloist, has a lot of control. But in jazz, they're changing the melody. The art of playing is to listen to a structure, and jazz pieces do have structure typically. I mean, it may be it's a popular song typically. That's or a blues. Um, but then you're creating a new melody over that, and you're also changing the chords slightly within the. I mean, you're adding extra chords really that lead from the main chord. But it's live. And so it's this incredible creative moment. Even if you're playing solo, you're listening to yourself, and then you get an idea, and then you solidify that idea by going with it and playing it out. And then imagine playing with a group, say a quartet. People
Mhm.
are, the quartet, they're all listening. And so you do something, and it becomes accentuated. Suddenly the bass player gets that idea and is working with it. So there's an interplay, and it's all live. And so it's highly creative and in the moment. So there's really nothing like it when you're playing. It's a high that you can't really Well, I guess I'm trying to explain it now, but that's I think the difference that you have a lot more freedom, still within the confines of that tune and the tradition, because you're playing something that, but someone walks into the room, they'll say, "Oh, that's jazz." I hear it, but
Right.
the subtlety is that you're actually inventing constantly, and you're never playing anything the same. At least the good players, because they're listening to themselves and they're delighting themselves
Mhm.
with they're surprising themselves.
Would you say, because of the improvisational nature of jazz, that it requires perhaps a greater amount of musicianship or skill? Or is it just a question of comparing two things that you can't really compare?
It's different. I mean, you watch say a classical pianist, a great one, and they're doing things physically, that jazz players could never do. I mean, there are a few crossovers, but not many, because
Mhm.
they just have to practice so much, and it's a physical. Usually with improvisation, you tend, at least I tend not to be pressing so hard on the boundaries of technique. And that's something that I've done as I've gotten older. Because early on, yeah, I was trying to show off, and that's always behind jazz a little bit too, is is,
Right.
is to show off. But at the same time, I guess conversely, uh, most classical musicians can't improvise. They have their head in the paper, in the manuscript, and they're not able to go off of that. I mean, I could be playing a piece by Bach and then transition it into something totally new, right on the spot. And that's because of improvising is different. You have to learn your instrument in a different way, because the art of improvisation is knowing what it's going to sound like when you play something. And
Mhm.
most classical musicians know the piece that they're playing, but anything outside of that, they couldn't predict what it's going to sound like. And you've heard some jazz players, particularly pianists, who are singing along or humming or doing something. It's them. They're in real time creating and singing. So there's no differentiation between the hand and the ear. And so it's in sync, and you know exactly what you're playing at that moment out, and it's not on the paper. So that's the difference, I think.
So the person who can do both is perhaps the more rare bird. I'm thinking there's two names that come to mind, and I could be completely wrong because I don't, like I said, I don't have that expertise, but two names that I think of that kind of flirt between classical and jazz, George Shearing and someone like Andre Previn, where both of them have, if I understand it correctly, both of them have a very steeped tradition in classical, but both of them seem to also at times have the ability to cross over into jazz. Is that, am I reading that correct? Is that, would that be two examples of that kind of musician?
Yeah, I mean, George Shearing is a little bit different. I mean, he puts classical elements into his jazz.
Okay.
But Andre Previn was initially um, he could write musicals. He could arrange. He was an incredible arranger and a great jazz player. And that was sort of his first life, and so very famous and very very good, and he had a melodic gift. I mean, he did just what I was talking about, but so well, creating these melodies over the melodies. Had a unique style, played rhythmically, could really swing and really press. But later on, he transitioned. In fact, he became a conductor first of the Pittsburgh Symphony, and then another, I think, a European symphony. It's escaping me now, but top tier symphony. And so he learned to conduct. I think his father was a great musician also, but he learned to conduct by doing musical type conducting of arrangements of jazz tunes and so forth. So he knew what he was doing, and he loved it. But his background probably was both. And then even during that time as a conductor, he was a performer, so he would perform Mozart concerti. He would perform all kinds of things. And he did a lot of chamber music, which is, and it's surprising how many conductors you think, oh, I didn't know they could play the piano, or but they could, and they that was their beginning, and so they play with these small ensembles, but they also lead an orchestra, and you can even lead an orchestra from the piano or from the keyboard, and that's how it was done in the Baroque period. So Previn is a different kind of cat, because he could do
Right.
everything at the highest level, in all these fields. Quite remarkable.
Isn't it true though? You talk about conductors, usually most of them can play multiple instruments and would. I mean, that do you is that you think that's a quality that allows a conductor to perhaps better direct different segments of the group because they have that experience with multiple instruments, or do you think do you think there are conductors out there that can do the job without having that firsthand knowledge?
I think you need to know how to play something well, but playing a bunch of instruments, I mean, the idea like of a band teacher, a high school teacher who can play the different wind instruments, it's really to be able to instruct. And and so when you're talking with beginners, yes, you need to be able to know how they make what are the fingerings, how is the embouchure. But when you're conducting, in a symphony with adults, you're not teaching them much, but you're teaching them how you envision the piece. I think there's some advantage in knowing string instruments when you're with an orchestra because bowing, those are decisions. It's not like here's exactly how you bow a piece. And so they need to know that as a player attacks with the down bow, it's going to be louder. And then as they go on, it gets softer, and they need to watch the bow, particularly when you're playing with a soloist, because eventually they're going to run out of bow and they're done. So you need to be sensitive to that. There are alternate type fingerings where you get into third position, you're playing very high. So knowing that helps, but no, it's not necessary to know multiple. I mean, someone like Leonard Bernstein, for example, was a really good pianist. I think a lot of them, piano is an instrument. I think that a lot of the better conductors share because they spend a lot of time looking at the score, playing transcriptions, and learning about the whole piece. So that gives you an advantage. But the main thing is they need to know.
Someone like Duke Ellington, perhaps.
Yeah, they need, but they need to know something pretty well. But I mean, yeah, Duke Ellington was I mean, a lot of the jazz band leaders were pianists.
Hmm. We are talking about the quote unquote affectations
Mhm.
that is prominent in some of the classical presentations of music. In jazz, it seems more extreme. And I don't know, and maybe I'm misreading it, but I think about somebody like, and you kind of alluded to it, someone like Keith Jarrett, who tends to kind of mumble and kind of murmur to himself as he's playing. Or you think of someone like Bill Evans, who looks like his back is broken. He's just kind of so hunched over the keyboard that it's everything that you hear keyboardists are not supposed to do. You think about the, upright, kind of straight back kind of a thing. And Bill Evans played as if there was something wrong with him physically. Does body posture, does murmuring or vocal kind of musings, does that is that a kind of a byproduct of them getting into the music, or is that part of the expression of the music? Where does that come from?
Well, let's take them separately. Let's talk about Keith Jarrett, who's a wonderful jazz pianist. I think maybe the best of the century, the past 100 years. And for me,
Wow.
yeah, it's a short list. But he did pure improvisations, and that's what he was most famous for initially, where he would just sit, put his head down, and play for 45 minutes, take a break, and then do the same thing, and then play a standard at the end. And um, but he also played with a lot of people like Miles Davis early on, and then later he switched to playing with a trio with I
Mm.
guess Gary Peacock, Jack DeJohnette, that became one of the most well-known and prominent trios. But he's talked about this, about what happens, when it's not just humming, but he has these outbursts, sometimes almost these, what do you call it when you're in this religious state and you're
A euphoria.
euphoria. That's right. And it comes out. And so he'll sigh, he'll do these, but it's joyful often. But he said that he's in this state where it's almost this I thou, where he's completely in the moment, and he's surprising, delighting himself. But when he's has the sounds coming out, I guess vocalizing, it's because the music that he's playing doesn't completely capture the moment that he's having internally, and so it wouldn't come out. He couldn't even define it musically by playing it because he's having an even higher experience that is beyond words, beyond music. And I thought that was profound. That there's some, so once again, he's having a musical experience that none of us can have because we're getting this incredible thing that we hear, and there's even more going on internally. Um, so that's part of it. The other part of kind of singing along, I mean, that's vocalizing while you're playing, particularly a keyboard instrument. That you can't. I mean, if you're playing a wind instrument, you're doing it already. But that's a sign, once again, that you know what you're going to be playing. And so you're singing along with yourself in real time.
Then someone like Bill Evans,
Hmm. That he tends to, I mean, a lot of times, I mean, I do this as a performer, you tend to cocoon, and that's introverting. And so he's having this experience. Yes, there's an audience out there, but he's also mainly playing for himself. And so um, but he's looking at the looking at his hands. That's the simplest explanation. He's watching his hands. He's not necessarily playing with his eyes closed. Some do, um, but he's in this space and not in pain. But for I can't imagine Bill Evans getting out what he did, sitting up straight in a perfect classical posture, because
right?
there's a tension of that, and leaning over, it relaxes your hands. And he had this incredibly lucid, sweet touch. And to do that, I think in that relaxed state is what he needed. And then he ignored the world. I mean, he was actually very introverted and not a performer. So in some sense, he wasn't performing. He was, performing for himself, but not externally.
Do you think there's a difference in a group dynamic, be it a trio, quartet, or a orchestra, when the conductor is a piano player as opposed to something like a drummer? And I think about someone like Gene Krupa. I think of someone like Buddy Rich. They all had their own bands. Do you think the dynamic is more tense, and do you think that creates not a better product necessarily, but a different product compared to a group that's led by a pianist?
I don't know. I wouldn't generalize that. I mean, from my own experience, I've had band leaders, who are drummers, and they tend to be a bit rigid. They're all about the tempo, but rigid meaning they're not going to slow down to let it breathe.
Right.
That's they tend. I mean, it's hard to execute that as a percussionist, but I remember accompanying or working with a vocalist, um, and but with a drummer who was the band leader. And I'd never met this singer, but she was really good, and there was a bass player, and so we were. I guess so. That's a quartet, right? There we were playing and some ballads, so some slow things, and he wanted the tempo to be a little bit faster and very regimented. And then at one point he took a break and he went out and we played a tune, the trio, and
Mhm.
and she remarked to me how flexible it was suddenly, and that I would listen to her phrase and take some time. So but that's again a one example, and I don't know as far as generalizing. I'm sure there's some great conductors who are percussionists for sure.
It is interesting because you think about, I think about someone like Buddy Rich, and he was such a over the top dynamic personality. And I sometimes wonder if he suffered for that, as far as the expectation is that he took on a bigger role within the confines of an orchestra than perhaps a drummer should. But it seems like the smaller the group gets, the more important the drummer becomes, because then the drummer is a part of what kind of drives the tempo. Typically, maybe that's more a rock thing, because I think about someone like Charlie Watts, of the Stones. The Stones are not the Stones without Charlie Watts, and I think he had a particular kind of style that kind of helped drive that engine. Whereas in a jazz formation, it becomes a little bit of a different sort of an animal.
Yeah, it kind of depends on what era you're talking about and what the role is. I mean, even when you get to bebop, the drummer is not, I mean, is doing time, but a whole lot more, and really commenting on the soloist and what's happening. They get real involved in I guess the traditional way. I mean, what I always recommend is when you're listening to say a jazz trio, is you listen to the bass player as a listener because they are making the rhythm. The rhythm is led by that bass player because there are two notes that a bass player plays. They have the snap and then they have the actual note that's on the beat. And that's what keeps the swing happening. So as a listener, listen to the bass player and you'll get into that. And then the drummer is spot on, and they're playing on that second bass beat and it's perfect. But the the best ensembles have a bass player and a drummer who practice together and are in tune. I mean, my dad played with some with a trio, and he said that the bass player and the drummer they spent hours together just playing time. And playing time is when you're just doing that, playing quarter notes on the beat with the drummer, and it's so subtle, but they have to be locked in, and then it makes it like you're just walking on air when you play with them because they're so on perfect. But I think that the part that's maybe misunderstood is the role of the bass player to really set the tempo, and the drummer is doing, it's not just playing time, but doing so much more to accentuate everything.
I think for a lot of people, the drummer has kind of like an unreasonable role within a group because I think most people think of drummers as kind of unrestrained musicians. They're always waiting for their drum solo kind of a thing, and Buddy Rich certainly kind of succumbed to that on many cases. I think about someone like um, Jimmy Cobb, who played with Miles Davis, on Kind of Blue and some of his other albums. I think about someone like Max Roach. I think about someone like Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, where I mean, Blakey could kind of stand out a bit, but he was also kind of better known to allow the rest of the musicians to shine because that was really kind of part of the focus of the Jazz Messengers was to kind of bring new talent. That's why the lineup constantly changed over Blakey's life. And so there's this notion that the drums are there, but they don't hold the prominence. They are a part, they fit is probably the best way of saying it. They fit within what the other musicians are doing. They're not doing anything separate from the rest of the group.
I mean, you're talking about the type of drummer that I like to play with. I like them playing with brushes also, as opposed to sticks for the most part. But that's the style that I play. Um, Drum solos that certainly have a place, and there's something in an up, fast jazz tune that's called trading fours, where you do four measures of maybe a piano solo, then the pianist drops out, and then the drummer takes four measures and does their thing, and then the piano player miraculously just nails that next beat, comes right in and does something cool, and the drummer follows, and doing that is a great time. It's sort of this. It's not just a compromise, but I think it's a perfect way to set up the final verse, and then you play it out. And so that's the kind of moments that I think that the drummer should do something. And if they're really talented, yeah, let them do their thing. But every piece doesn't need a drum solo necessarily or a bass solo. And bass solos are, can be wonderful. I mean, you have some melodic players who are just incredibly good at that as well. And they need to be heard because sometimes a lot of old records you have a bass solo and nobody can hear. What was that? What was that? Didn't So, but
Yeah.
in a good studio recording where you can hear everything, they're surprisingly melodic and beautiful. Some of the greatest moments are bass solos.
So the engineer really becomes kind of the hero of the recording to be able to pull that out so that people can hear it. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not ideal maybe for a big arena, but in an intimate setting where everybody can hear the bass, it's an incredible moment, because it gets quiet and the pianist is just, I mean, they play, they don't just sit out. I mean, sometimes they do, but mainly they're playing just a little chord here and trying to comp, which and comp is means like being complimentary. They're hitting little chords to accentuate, so they're listening, boom, hit something there and listen, and then as soon as the bass solo is getting finished, the temp or the volume typically goes up, and the bass player gives it away, saying, "Okay, I'm done," and they start playing time again, and that's a real cool moment, and then it locks in with everybody.
you're talking about the fact that classical music is this very structured format. This is something that is that it serves the notes on the page, and that jazz, while improvisational, also has its own structure. But the great thing about jazz is that it's a structure. The French call it like a cadre, where you have this kind of parameter, but within the parameter, there's a lot of flexibility that happens. But then you have the jazz music that goes completely off the chart and off the paper. And I'm thinking about people like Ornette Coleman or Eric Dolphy, where you have kind of the free jazz movement. Miles Davis flirted with this a little bit in the late 60s, early 70s. And to the uninitiated, it sounds like a string of discordant kind of strikes. As a musician of your caliber who has had the training that you've had, is this something that's completely, I mean, this may be a question that's more about your personal preference, but um, how do you square something like free jazz, into the artistry and the discipline of the musicianship?
Um, there's something called modal jazz, which has, this, it's not, I mean, kind of the center, this tonal center. And so that gives some constraints. This is not free jazz, but it has, and often people just jam on two chords.
Mm,
They'll play an E minor chord, an F sharp minor chord, and kind of like on My Favorite Things, they play the tune and they get into this riff, which is just back and forth repetitive. And that's comfortable. I mean, a lot of players can do a lot of things, but something that's totally free means there's no structure at all. But there's listening, so you're listening to each other. I mean, I do improvised piano, but I'm still creating some structure as I go. And so
mm,
so playing something like Ornette Coleman that's just out there and then listening to somebody else. So it's a heightened listening between the players and trust.
mm.
It's a tightrope walk. And so my guess, and I haven't listened to a lot of it, is that it either works or it doesn't. And a lot of it is, it's experimental but there's probably some incredible moments as well. But there are these little insights like Miles Davis talks about. It's not about perfection at all. It's about the enlightened moments that are surprises. And I think it's set up for that type of thing.
That's what Thelonious Monk said, but when he
Mhm.
said that perfection was boring, that there was something even more intriguing
Mhm.
by something that does not follow a pattern, does not follow the script, as it were.
That's right. And I mean, if you transition to classical music, there then it's really there's so much difference between performances. I mean, you listen to conductors and how they interpret a piece is very different. And certainly soloists. I mean, I spend my time on YouTube watching piano concertos and
Mm,
different. So I'll watch like the Chopin first piano concerto, E minor, and
mm,
about three or four different pianists play it. And I may listen to the whole thing, or I'll listen to a little bit and stop, and then let's listen to Marta Argerich play this, and then let's hear Vladimir Horowitz play it. And
mm.
it's really exciting. But the performance they bring so much individual style to, so you don't just listen to a Mozart piano concerto by anybody. You listen to somebody like Maria Pariah, somebody who really specializes in a way in that period. And that performer is not going to play Rachmaninoff or something more romantic and big. And so they get, into little specialties. I mean, Glenn Gould essentially played Bach,
Hmm.
on the piano. So as you listen and learn, you learn that it's really about the performance, and they bring so much, um, that just the piece in this kind of pure form that we think of, oh, it's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Listen to it, but listen to, you know Herbert von Karajan, the German conductor, or listen to Leonard Bernstein or somebody else. It's going to be very different.
Hmm. There's two more things I wanted to ask you about with regards to jazz. One of them has to do with, again, it may be a kind of a preference question, and the second one has to do more with kind of a legacy question. I'm going to do the preference question first.
Mhm.
Because one of the instruments that sometimes is derided among jazz purists is the guitar. And whether you go all the way back to Django Reinhardt, in maybe more modern examples being someone like John McLaughlin or Paco de Lucia or something like that, it seems to have a role to play. But why do you think the guitar is so divisive when you talk to people who play jazz? That either a guitar has no place in it, or it can work. The instrument is flexible and diverse enough that it can fit within any genre.
It depends on the player. There's always a fight between pianists and guitar players because they're both playing chords. And
Right.
and chords, it's not like there's the chord that's written, everybody's going to play it. You could set up with a different chord, and there are alternative chords all the time. And so instead of, say, you're in the key of C major and you play a G seventh, that's a dominant chord that leads back to C. You could also play a D flat seventh, maybe with a augmented ninth or something else in it, that leads back to the same thing. But if you play a D flat chord on top of a G seventh, you have a clash.
Hmm.
And so you need to be playing together. But I think that, guitar players, they solo, and so it's a real flexible instrument, and they're some incredible, really adept musicians, that can do all kinds of things, in a solo. But also they're great at playing chords, and so in some ways you yield the space, to the guitar player, and then the pianist is just accentuating a little bit because you can't both accompany, and make choices. And so, unless you're on the same page, I mean, you mentioned George Shearing. His quintet, he played with a guitar player, and they were locked in, but they were very much rehearsed. Um, so I don't know about maligned. I mean, one of my favorite guitarists is Pat Metheny, and just incredible composer and soloist. Um, so I mean, I enjoy listening to them. There's not, to me, and this is being, because I'm a pianist, you can hear the name of the pianist by hearing about a measure. Oh yeah, that's Keith Jarrett. Oh, that's Oscar Peterson. That's Andre Previn, because the touch is so different. But if you hear
Hmm.
a guitar player, you need a little bit more space to recognize them, unless it's Django Reinhardt, which he had this unique.
Very unique sound.
Yeah, but for the most part, I think so. That's it. So to get the personality of the player is a little bit different. You need a little bit more space. I would say that a guitar, particularly in jazz, is a real subtle instrument. Um, and
That's probably one of the reasons why it's hard to tell them apart. If you compare guitar players in jazz as opposed to rock, the guitar in rock sounds can be so distinctive. You
yeah,
can, within a couple of notes, you can figure out, oh, that's so and so.
yeah,
That's Keith Richards, or that's The Edge, or whatever the case may be, because that sound is so distinctive
yeah,
because they're so featured. But in a jazz kind of environment, they're not featured, but rather they become that kind of more nuanced addition to the overall sound.
yeah. And a rock and roll guitarist is certainly not subtle. Um, but some incredible musicians, for sure. And so I probably spend as much time listening to, rock and roll as anything. I think I'm not going to say it cleanses the palate, but you can't just listen to, Beethoven all day. You need to
Right.
mix it up. And I have a rule. I mean, I work from home, running, A Heart Solutions educational research. Um, but I listen to Baroque music, in the morning, and then more romantic period until about 3 o'clock, and then at three I shift to jazz. And you can probably guess who I listen to. It's not Keith Jarrett typically, it's Bill Evans. And so he's my go-to. Um, Not that I want him playing in the background while I'm working, but it sort of transitions me to calling it a day. That's when I know, okay, the day is moving on.
The last question I had comes out of what happened to Miles Davis. When Miles Davis got into the late 60s and early 70s, it seemed like he got bored with jazz. And, he often said he would never play. I mean, people wanted him to, but he would never play like in concert Freddie Freeloader again. It was always going to be whatever it was that he was doing at that time. He saw no value in revisiting jazz because that period of his life had passed. And it begs the question, to what extent can jazz progress or change and still be considered jazz? That could be part of the complaint about guitar, is that some people think that this is adding something that's quote unquote traditionally not part of the jazz scene. But to what extent do you think jazz can progress and still be by ear? Oh, that's jazz.
That would be a good question for someone like Wynton Marsalis.
Mm,
He could answer that because he's a historian, and he often goes back to talking about Louis Armstrong and the real roots of jazz. Um, but jazz certainly isn't a museum, though a lot of people perceive it as that. The
mhm,
the trouble is that it kind of became the most innovative in the late 50s, early 60s, with John Coltrane and some of these things. And then anything, things that came after that were in some ways more conservative. And Miles Davis became more sparse in his playing, because he did bebop, and he did that so well. He was known for that, and he sort of left it behind. But he was an innovator, and um, he didn't want to just rest on what he did before. So I
well,
mean,
he ended up doing what Herbie Hancock did
right.
when both of them got into electronics, and they got
Yeah.
into a lot of this kind of new age wave kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And I think Herbie Hancock was probably perhaps more willing to kind of revisit
Mhm.
Cantaloupe Island, or whatever
Yeah, he came
whatever it
back.
is that yeah, compared to Miles Davis. But those are two examples of two kind of jazz greats
Mhm.
who went in that direction.
Yeah, and it was, trying to be part of the time, and so electronic jazz, certainly became a thing. And then I guess in the 1980s, early 80s, you got what was it called? But a lot of groups had that kind of that sound fusion. It was
Yeah,
called Weather Report, and some really cool.
Spiral Gyro,
Yeah,
and yeah.
yeah, some cool laid back, fun music. But um, I think that time with electronic music is part of the history. But for me, that's not what I listen to. I don't open up the catalog of Miles Davis and go to the electronic part necessarily.
Mhm.
But that's a matter of taste. I'm sure some people really loved it.
But it does elicit perhaps the most visceral reaction. Whether you're talking about when Muddy Waters played at the Newport Jazz Festival, and he kind of represented kind of reintroduction of blues, but then someone like Bob Dylan introducing the electric guitar that just flipped out a lot of folk
Mhm.
musicians and fans as something that was kind of like a perversion
Yeah.
of the original play. When you think about country music traditionally had always been, the old joke was three chords and the truth. And then you get kind of like this, what some people nowadays call bro country, where it's kind of like it's hard to distinguish it from
Mhm.
kind of popular music en masse. There's nothing distinctive about it. And some would say the musicianship is lacking as well. There's always going to be that huge kind of blowback to anybody who tries to do something different with something that's considered sacrosanct.
Yeah, I think that I like the way you said that. In a bar is where jazz belongs. I mean that
Mm.
so it's part of that scene. And not necessarily in a stadium or an outdoor concert. It's an intimate genre and it's
Mm,
subtle. We were talking about how subtle guitar players does it project. Rock and roll works in those bigger settings, but jazz doesn't. So in a way, it got away from itself in the smaller venues. I do like the development of it moving into the concert hall. And that
mhm.
happened with Duke Ellington. Particularly it became a serious music, and people would dress up and go sit there. But there's also a part about moving, dancing, and drinking and talking and being part of that moment. But in an intimate setting in a club, and it's easy to get away from that. But I think that's where jazz is most comfortable.
So, of all the things we've talked about, controversies and techniques and structure and what have you, does any of that tick you off more than having a classical or jazz station supplanted with Christmas music a month and a half out of the year?
Um, we were just having a really nice conversation. Um, yes, I listen to classical music station, when I'm in the car, and
Yes.
and so they're pandering, doing nothing but Christmas music. Occasionally, they'll play something like Bach Christmas Oratorio or something that
Yeah.
that I can listen to any time of the year. But I run out of interest very quickly, and it's really because I played so many of these songs. I had to, playing in restaurants and bars and
Mhm.
clubs and hotels and things. So I just got tired of them. But it's too much. I mean, tomorrow, we're gonna, or today, I think tomorrow we're gonna do our Christmas tree, and probably listen to Sinatra singing some of those Christmas songs, and I'm quite happy with that. I couldn't, uh, there would be something wrong with me if I couldn't listen to that. But it's too much, and a classical station should have a balance. You don't just do that and nothing else. It's just like a grocery store playing Christmas songs. I actively hate it to the point where I would stay home and do anything but hear it. So I get tired of it. I don't think it should be celebrated for 3 months straight. And but no, it's not a it wears you out. I'm worn out. I'm looking forward to January.
It is strange that radio stations would go from having people turn on the radio to listen to music to turn on the radio and basically have it serve as background. Because that's a lot of times when people put Christmas music on, it's typically not to sing along, but it's typically to have it as a backdrop to cooking, to opening presents, to whatever the case may be. It's relegating the function of the station and minimizing it in so many ways. It is kind of a strange phenomenon that they would do this to themselves, but it must pay off money wise because so many people get into it.
Yeah, I think people love it. I'm a curmudgeon, but I listen to music at this stage of my life to get insights into the hidden mysteries of existence, and not to listen to "Here We Come a Caroling" or whatever that's called. I hate to degrade some really wonderful songs, but I'm tired of it. That's it.
Okay, well, to wrap this up and
Oh,
yet place Christmas in its proper perspective, what is the Christmas song that you dislike the most?
oh, an individual song.
Yes. As
Um,
soon as you hear it, you just punch out, you hit the button, or you just turn it off, or you just walk away.
there are so
Is there a
many.
song?
That's a hard one because there are so many. No, I couldn't just identify one. You just call out a tune. I'll say hate it, hate it, hate it, hate it, hate it. Um, but no, do you have one that just turns your skin?
There's a Paul McCartney song that has this kind of strange instrumentation at the beginning. And I can't even mimic it now, but it's every time I hear those beginning chords, I just oh God, I just turn it off. I walk away or whatever the case may be. I can't take it. Then there are the Christmas songs that are so overly wrought. And the song that immediately comes to mind is I'll Be Home for Christmas. And I get that people like that, but it's like people put that on purposely to be depressed, and I don't I don't
Oh
get it.
no, you're a terrible person. That's a beautiful song.
Yes,
You
it's a
picked that
fine
one to hate.
song.
I mean, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas is wonderful. Listen to the James Taylor version because he has sort of this alternate lyric that, it's beautiful. And if you've ever lost family members and think back to Christmas of old, and so there are some wonderful things. And I'm reminded of growing up, so it does bring things back. You remember that, but
But
in,
see, that's the thing though. When you put on Bing Crosby
yeah,
and there's that, I it's designed to create a feeling that I don't necessarily want to feel.
you're
And
not
I think
comfortable with feeling nostalgic.
well, you know where it started. It started with when I was in the Gulf War during
Oh,
Christmas. We had a thing where we would not allow people to play Christmas music because it just depressed the hell out of us. But that song, perhaps more than any, because
okay.
it perhaps most encapsulated what everyone was thinking. But you don't necessarily want that reaffirmed or magnified by listening to that damn song. As fine as it is, as beautiful as it is, as wonderful as it is in isolation, it's just not a feeling that I want to be mired in. And you can't help but go there emotionally every time you hear that song.
So did you like go beat up the person who played it?
Yeah, we would.
You would.
Anybody who dared, anybody who dared played anything like that, a bunch of us would descend upon them, and smack them around a little bit. It's good natured, but we
Sure.
don't want to observe Christmas by beating up our fellow man. But it's just something that you just didn't want to hear because it was so maudlin. It was too much. And so I think for me, it's a song that even though I recognize it's a great song, as you said, it's not an emotion I choose to tap into.
Okay, so I have my opinions on music, and you actually get violent about it. What separates us here, Miller?
Well, with that, perhaps we've exhausted my stupid questions about jazz and classical music, but hopefully through the stuff that you talked about. That's something that's going to be of interest to people. And because I love jazz, I love everything about it. My father was a jazz musician, and so I always grew up around it, but I don't think I ever really understood it to the degree that I feel like I understand it now, even though it's a layman's understanding because I'm not a musician, but it's just something that I love talking about, but I don't think we've ever really properly dug into it. So I think we just did.
Well,
So
it's the old school. That's what we do here.
that's what we do here. So, all right, with that, we shall say adieu to you, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.
Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Miller.